Hi, welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a minute. And if you would like to put where you're joining us from in the chat box, that would be great.
Oh, Corey, I think I've seen Corey on your Facebook page, Kim.
Yeah, Corey's a good friend. Thanks for being here, Corey. Corey is the founder of Darfur and Beyond here.
Welcome, Patricia. Is everyone following the news out of Sudan in the last couple of days?
Not good.
Oh, Howard's from Pawtucket. Welcome. There's a lot of good coverage, Corey, and the New York Times and Washington Post have a lot of good coverage of what's happening right now, particularly in Khartoum.
And Dr. Errol, thanks for being with us this week. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Kate, would you like to start first, though?
Yes, I want to start by thanking you all for coming, whether you're with us live or whether you're joining us in a later recording. We've really loved sharing this whole webinar series this year, and we're so glad that you could be with us. And we're especially pleased to offer this as a free program. So if you're able, would you please consider donating to EIHR in whatever amount you can, $5, $10, whatever is possible. Every bit of it goes to support the teachers in the world that are joining to fight against hate. So if you would, please just go to our website, www.eihr.org/donate to contribute. Thanks so much, Kim.
You're welcome. Thank you. So yes, thank you for being here with us on a Sunday. Our series theme this year has been trauma and healing, teaching and learning in today's climate. My name is Kim Klett, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. EIHR cultivates partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices in Holocaust and human rights education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching conflict history and prevention, and sustainable peace. Learn more about us at eihr.org. We are so happy to have a lot of returning folks today and new folks on our webinar. We know you will enjoy today's session with Dr. Biz Herman entitled How We Speak About Trauma. Please watch our website for the next series, which will begin again in October. I would like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nachatank or Anacostan people and the elders, both past and present, throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. To learn about on whose land you reside, please visit native-land, let's try that again, .ca, and I'll put that in the chat box. I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Biz Herman. She is a Borders and Boundaries postdoctoral fellow with the Perry World House at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research examines how experiencing violence in the context of conflict and forced migration shapes social cohesion and prospects for sustainable peace. She is a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research's Trauma and Global Mental Health Lab, a member of the Human Trafficking Vulnerability Lab, and previously served as a Fulbright Fellow to Bangladesh and an Innovation Fellow at Beyond Conflict's Innovation Lab, which applies research findings from cognitive and behavioral science to the study of social conflict. Biz received her PhD in political science from University of California, Berkeley, and her BA in political science and economics from Tufts University. In addition to her academic work, Biz is an Emmy-nominated visual journalist. In 2019, she was the lead photographer and researcher on the Women of the 116th Congress for the New York Times, which featured portraits of 130 women serving in the 116th Congress. The story ran as a special section and was subsequently published as a book with a foreword by one of my favorite authors, Roxane Gay. More information on her work is available at www.bizherman.com. And as Dr. Herman is speaking today, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. We'll field those, and we'll have time for Q&A after her presentation. So Biz, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that kind introduction, and Kim and Kate for having me. As Kim noted, I'm really happy to take questions. We're going to have a dedicated question and answer session at the very end, but a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about today are definitional, are trying to sort of get us all on the same page about what we mean when we talk about trauma. So I'm very happy to answer clarifying questions throughout the course of the presentation. So feel free to drop those in the Q&A box, and they'll be fed to me. So I wanted to just start by saying, I'm very grateful to be here. This is a topic that I care deeply about, and it's been great to see how trauma and mental health has come more into the public view. I think some of that might be because of COVID, but I think a lot of it is because of really innovative research and practice being done by people around the world. And so I'm talking about a very small snippet of that work today, and I'm coming from a political science lens as a social scientist, so not as a clinician, not as someone who actually delivers mental health care, but as someone who's able to sort of think about the bigger pictures of how mental health might affect social cohesion, prospects for peace, and why I think it's important that we consider exactly what we mean when we talk about trauma, and how we can then take those concepts and apply them in the real world. And make sure that they actually reflect the lived experiences of people who have lived through conflict, forced migration, and other kinds of trauma experiences. So just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'll be signposting as we'll be going through to make sure that everyone's on the same page. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I came to this work and why I think it's important, both personally, professionally, and in practice. I'm going to talk about some definitional, the concepts that we'll be talking about today, providing some definitions for those, talk briefly about a few applications and the innovations that have emerged in recent years in mental health care and well-being, and then open it up to discussion and ask you all about how these things might apply in your own work, questions you might have about applying these concepts in your own work, and anything else you might want to talk about. So briefly to talk about how I came to this work. Before I started my graduate studies, I worked as a visual journalist, and I worked on this project called A Woman's War, where I interviewed and documented photographs, portraits, and oral histories of over 120 women that had served in various roles in conflicts around the world. So I worked in 6 different countries, in Vietnam, Bangladesh, Bosnia, Northern Ireland, Egypt, and the United States. And I spoke to women that served really myriad roles in these conflicts. So women who had been spies, or had been combat officers, or who had taken care of logistics, or been healthcare providers. And so and these conflicts spanned a huge period of time. And women were of various ages when they were participating, and they participated for various periods of time. So there was a lot of variation in their own individual stories. But one of the key themes that came out of the stories that they shared was that these experiences had deep and profound impacts on their lives. Not all negative, but nearly all had experienced some kind of trauma exposure, which I'll define shortly. And they had various reactions to it, and they had imprinted on their lives in different ways. And so that really got me thinking about how are we thinking about and conceptualizing and taking account of the effect of individual trauma exposures in the context of trying to build peace in the aftermath of conflict and forced migration. And that was really the basis of my dissertation work. And this is the question that really drives it. So how can improving individual mental health affect community well-being? And I think that this is really a significant shift that I've seen both in research and practice in the past 5 to 7 years, is that there's an increasing understanding that mental health as experienced at the individual level really can impact the health and well-being of a community as a whole. And if you think about it, just to kind of take the big picture approach, it's intuitively obvious. If you just think about when you're having a bad day, or when you're struggling with some kind of mental health challenge, or when people you know, that affects their interpersonal interactions. And so when you aggregate up, communities are made up of individuals. Those individuals are having interpersonal interactions with people. And so understanding how our own individual mental health affects those interactions and in turn affects community well-being was something that I thought was really understudied and was something that I think practitioners were way ahead of the curve on in understanding the way that trauma lasted in people's lives. And so what this work really tries to do is tries to catch up research with practice. So to make sure that we're all sort of talking about the same things, this is a graph of the use of the word trauma, is the line in blue, and the word mental health, or the phrase mental health, in the corpus of books. So all of the books that exist in Google Books from 1900 to 2020. And as you can see, there's been a significant increase in the use of the phrases trauma and mental health. And I think that this really reflects the increased interest in mental health and in trauma among sort of the general population, especially with COVID, especially as individuals were sort of forced to stay home and reflect quite a lot and faced with a lot of individual traumas and social traumas. It was really important. It's become much more part of the public conversation. But what happens when words and phrases become more part of the public conversation is that the definitions can kind of be liberally applied. So in talking about what a trauma exposure is, this is the definition as it's set out in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, which is used by clinicians to help diagnose individuals with mental health care issues. But a trauma exposure is defined as a direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury, or threat to one's physical integrity, or witnessing an event that involves death, injury, or threat to the physical integrity of another person. And that could be someone that you do or do not know personally, or learning about the unexpected or violent death, serious harm, or threat of death or injury of a family member or other close associate. So I think what's really important about this kind of definition of trauma exposure is that it provides a sort of bound of what is counted as a trauma exposure. It's a very broad definition. So it could be you're experiencing it yourself, you're witnessing something happening to someone else, or you're learning about something that is very unexpected happening to someone you love. But it also sort of creates a delineation of what counts within the bounds of a trauma exposure and what does not. And the reason why this definition I think is useful to use is both because in research, so as an example, in political science research, a lot of the times political scientists study violence. But the idea that a trauma exposure or a trauma event has to involve violence is not always the case. Being forcibly displaced from your home can constitute a trauma exposure. Learning about a loved one being forcibly displaced from their home can also constitute a trauma exposure. So I think that this is the sort of importance of thinking about how we're using these phrases and what actually makes up the content within these phrases. The other thing that I think is really useful about this definition of a trauma exposure is that it separates out the event from the individual reaction to it. So it's key that experiencing a trauma exposure does not necessarily mean that a person is going to have a specific response to it. And this is why humans are so fascinating. Because if we were all in the same place and we all experienced the same kind of trauma exposure, we would all have different reactions to it. And our reactions would be different across each of us and within ourselves over time. And this is a really key and interesting insight from psych research and the trauma studies literature over the past few decades is that, I think there's been a push to destigmatize the fact that people who have had trauma exposures in the past might have adverse events in the future, might have challenges in functioning in the future, which is really good that that has been destigmatized. But for example, in the push to sort of destigmatize individuals who are dealing with PTSD symptoms, for example, combat veterans who had PTSD symptoms after coming back home, there were reports by certain combat veterans saying that there was then sort of this belief that anyone who had served in war had PTSD, which is not true. People have very varied reactions, and those reactions can look really different across individuals. So, for example, some people have no change in functioning. They experience a trauma exposure, and their functioning after that trauma exposure is no different from what it was before. And some individuals might end up developing what are basically persistent, unwanted, adverse changes in their functioning. So things that are, PTSD symptomology or depression or anxiety symptoms. But a really key thing about these responses is that these responses are often rooted in adaptive evolutionary processes that came about to ensure our survival. So for example, if someone is hypervigilant in the aftermath of a trauma event, that's because that's a very natural adaptive reaction to when you faced trauma in the past. And if someone is still in a setting in which they might experience a trauma event in the future, so for example, if someone's living in an active conflict zone, being able to be hypervigilant and respond to threats really quickly is an adaptive skill. It's going to help keep you alive, and it's going to help keep you safe. It's when you're no longer in those settings in which you're in active danger that those adaptations can become detrimental to your functioning, potentially. And so that's what a lot of interventions that seek to help individuals mitigate adverse symptoms in the aftermath of a trauma event that are no longer serving them are for. So this is a chart from a paper by two trauma studies researchers, Bonanno and Mancini, who posited this sort of individual differences model, which is basically just a way of saying that people are going to respond differently to different kinds of trauma exposures, and that they hypothesized that these responses took on these four prototypic kind of trajectories. So the first is a chronic response. So people who would develop chronic adverse changes to their functioning. A delayed response. So people seem fine in the aftermath of a trauma exposure, and then eventually, maybe years later, have adverse functioning symptoms develop afterwards. People who develop adverse responses sort of in the near aftermath of a trauma exposure, but then those symptoms improve, which is recovery, and resilience, which is individuals who have a sort of short-term response to a trauma event, but then those adverse responses dissipate over time. And a key thing that they noted was that feeling badly, having a sort of a negative reaction or negative feelings about a trauma exposure is actually the standard and is not a pathology, is not something that you should see as something that needs to be worked through, because everybody in the immediate aftermath of a trauma exposure is likely going to feel shaken, is going to have some adverse symptoms in the immediate aftermath. It's when these things pop up either later or they don't dissipate over time that they could start to interfere with an individual's ability to interact with their job, their loved ones, their schooling, things like that. And so one of the other things that the research has found is that most individuals, the majority of individuals, if they experience a single trauma exposure, so if someone gets into a car crash, oftentimes individuals don't develop these adverse symptoms that persist after a single trauma exposure. It's often much more likely for individuals to develop adverse responses when the trauma exposure is chronic or prolonged. So when they're experiencing multiple trauma exposures, as is much more common in a conflict zone or in the context of forced migration, or if the trauma is ongoing. And so that often can be the case for things like interpersonal traumas or childhood traumas, and where the child can't exit the household situation. So a common question in response to this is that why do some individuals respond one way and others individuals respond another way? And this is an open question in the research. There are certain factors that have been found to be associated with certain kinds of responses, but there's not been anything that has been found to be both necessary and sufficient for the continuation of normal functioning. So there's nothing that's been like, if you have this, then you will not develop adverse responses in the aftermath. So some things that have been found to be linked with the development of adverse responses include things like the age at the time of onset. So people that experience trauma exposures in their childhood are more likely to have adverse responses as opposed to someone who is in adulthood when they experience the trauma exposure. The chronicity of the exposure, as I mentioned before, so if the trauma is ongoing or prolonged, whether the trauma exposure was interpersonal, so if it was perpetuated or perpetrated by someone that you know, and then also, interestingly, the psychological reactions that an individual has both immediately during and immediately after the exposure. So what were the actual processes that were happening as you were experiencing the trauma exposure and right in its aftermath? And the kinds of responses, this could be a whole talk in and of itself, and a talk that would be much better given by a clinical psychologist. But just to briefly talk about some of the trauma responses that people might have, include things that are commonly characterized as fight or flight responses. So things like excessive vigilance, heightened threat reactivity, and increased anxiety, or things that might look very different from that are often characterized as freeze or immobilizing responses. So numbing, disassociating, avoiding certain stimuli, or anhedonia, which is basically the inability to feel happiness. And these things can change over time, and they can look very different in different individuals. So heightened threat reactivity might not look the same in me as it looks in Kim. And so one of the challenges of sort of being able to assess whether or not an individual has these kinds of symptoms is both being able to figure out how to assess them in a way that people feel comfortable sharing their symptoms and sharing their past experiences, and making sure that if you're developing, for example, a battery to be able to assess these things, that battery is contextually relevant and it's culturally relevant. So for example, referring to nightmares the idea of nightmares might be conceptualized differently in different contexts. And so this is I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, but there's a whole robust body of research looking at how do we translate these concepts, which are rooted in sort of these evolutionary responses to living through threat. So really do have some universal elements to them across contexts, across cultures over time. But how do we verbalize them? How do we conceptualize and define them in a way that we're able to assess and look at them across different contexts in a way that both translates and is consistent across those contexts, but also makes sense in the given context in which they're being measured? So what I want to talk about now is the role of emotion regulation, which is something that my research has come to focus on, in trying to think about how low cost, scalable interventions that can be delivered by non-specialists, so people who aren't trained psychologists, but do receive training in an intervention, can be deployed and what role they can have. So the emotion regulation of sort of broad, one definition of emotion regulation is an individual's ability to regulate and modulate their emotional responses in a way that's proportional to stimuli. And emotion regulation has been found to be this thing that across different kinds of sort of psychopathologies, so across people who have been diagnosed with a depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder or PTSD or a stress disorder, emotion regulation tends to be something that's affected across all of these different psychopathologies. And so the idea is that emotion regulation is this really powerful tool that, regardless of the specific kinds of responses that individuals have, that improving emotion regulation can help individuals mitigate their symptoms, their specific symptoms that they're having. So say I was dealing with depression symptoms, the idea is that if I was able to improve my emotion regulation skills, if I was to be able to develop my capacity for emotion regulation, that I would be able to help mitigate some of the adverse effects of my depressive symptoms or of my anxiety symptoms. So even if I was in a setting where I wasn't able to seek out mental health care because there was a lack of providers, there were a lack of providers that provided service in my language, or because there was stigma surrounding mental health care, that if I was able to develop the capacity for emotion regulation, I'd still be able to help improve my mental health and well-being, even if I couldn't seek out care, formal care in that way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk briefly about some applications and why these applications have been increasing in recent years. And so this is something that individuals might have come across in their work, or there's been a lot more trainings in the classroom about how to develop emotion regulation among kids. But there's been an increased focus on the role of mental health and community well-being. So this is what I opened with in saying that there's an increasing acknowledgement that communities are made up of individuals, that our own mental health and well-being affects the way that we interact with other people in our communities. And therefore, it's important to provide support for individuals' mental well-being, not just for the good of improving individuals' mental health, but because that will help support healthy communities. And so this was UNDP's Human Development Report from 2021 and 2022. And there was a huge focus on mental health and the role in peace and in community stability. And this quote, I think, really well demonstrates that, saying that mental well-being shapes the way that people think, act, and interact. Healthy regulation of emotions and overall mental well-being are crucial for peaceful and cohesive societies. And this is something that feels very intuitively obvious, but was not always linked, both in practice and in research, but has increasingly been so. So one of the challenges, though, is that as there's this increased desire for mental health care, that it's really hard and costly to deliver mental health care in the model that's been developed in the West. The sort of talk therapy, one-on-one delivery is both something that costs a lot, takes a lot of time, requires a lot of providers, and also doesn't make sense in every context. That model is not necessarily the right model for every place. And even if it were the right model for every place, there's not enough people who are trained to deliver that. And it's going to take a long time to scale that up. So there's a desire to develop and implement sort of more low-cost, scalable mental health interventions. And a lot of these interventions people might have come across in their work already, but a lot of them rely on sort of peer-to-peer provision of service of mental health and psychosocial support. So things like training lay people in the community to be able to provide not, therapy in the way that it's sort of seen in one-on-one talk therapy modalities, but more in terms of there are often group models, there can be one-on-one models, but it might be more oriented towards short-term problem solving, focusing on specific modules that might be on stress management or emotion regulation or connecting with individuals in your community. And so these models have been developed and are being evaluated in many, many contexts, both models that have been developed specifically for certain contexts and models that have been developed sort of generally. And the idea is now to evaluate them in different contexts. And that's something that the Trauma and Global Mental Health Lab that I'm a visiting scholar at does incredibly well. I encourage you to check out their website. They've run a number of studies evaluating low-cost, scalable mental health interventions in a number of contexts. And if there's anyone that's looking to partner with sort of a research entity to be able to evaluate a program that they want to do, either they have great capacity to do that or they know other folks who can do that as well. I worked on one such evaluation with Dr. Vivian Kadari and Michael Nikinchuk, where we evaluated a novel psychoeducational program that Mike was the lead in authoring, called the Field Guide for Barefoot Psychology, which was developed for Syrian refugees living in Zaatari refugee camp. And the individuals that enrolled in the study were reflective of the broader population living in Zaatari refugee camp, and there was widespread trauma exposure. So about 98% of the sample reported experiencing at least one kind of trauma exposure, and individuals on average reported experiencing about 6 different kinds from a list of 12 different kinds of trauma exposures. And that is not a comprehensive list. So it was an undercount, and even then it was still very widespread. And so here you see the partners that worked on this study. So Beyond Conflict was the lead author on the program. Questscope was the implementing partner in Zaatari Camp. Ford Foundation funded the intervention and the evaluation, and Berkeley and the New School, we were the research partners. And so you can see here, this was filming some of the self-care exercises that were part of the intervention itself. So the intervention was it was a book that opened with storytelling. So it followed a brother and sister that were being forcibly displaced, and it followed their journey before displacement, in the middle of displacement, and after displacement. And then, so each chapter opened with a part of their story. And then the content, the second part of the chapter would be addressing different scientific concepts that were raised during the story portion of the chapter. And then there'd be an accompanying self-care exercise that would allow individuals to sort of implement the concepts, the brain-body science concepts that they had read about in the chapter and had sort of personalized in the storytelling component. And so the intervention was really designed, among other things, to try and target and improve emotion regulation. And we used a randomized control trial and found that the intervention, which was an 8-week peer-to-peer led, so it was delivered by Syrian refugees living in Zaatari who had received a 3-week training in implementing the program and also had supervision throughout the course of the intervention. It led to a 19% improvement in emotion regulation for those who received the intervention, and that those improvements in emotion regulation were in turn associated with a 12% improvement in outgroup trust. So in self-reported outgroup trust with members of sort of outside groups, as were reported by the participants themselves, and a 9% increase in perceived communal security. So the real point of this intervention was that we were trying to see not just whether or not the field guide would work in and of itself on impacting individual mental health, but we really wanted to go into this to see whether or not those improvements in mental health had any kind of association with improvements in these indicators of community well-being. And so this is the kind of work that I think can really help us understand both the linkages between individual mental health and community well-being, and also can help show that it's worth investing in mental health interventions, not just to help individuals with their own mental health and well-being, but also to build stronger and more peaceable communities. And so I wanted to briefly have this slide at the end, because I think that when you think of these sorts of concepts, one thing that has been talked about quite a lot recently is how you can take a trauma-informed approach in your work. So this is, I think, a much more common conversation for healthcare providers and educators and medical professionals. I'm working on a project to try and develop trauma-informed data collection protocols. There's great guidance for journalists in adopting trauma-informed interviewing techniques. But I think that these sorts of approaches are just useful both in work and in everyday life. And sort of in understanding that anyone who you might be interacting with may have had some kind of trauma in their past, and that could be influencing their behavior, is just a helpful thing to keep in mind as being a human in this world, I think. And so if anyone wants additional resources on this, I'm happy to send additional ones to Kim and Kate to circulate afterwards, but there's really good resources online. I pulled this from the Serious Mental Health Advisor website, but these are just some trauma-informed principles, including promoting trauma awareness and understanding, which is the heart of what we're doing today. Recognizing trauma-related symptoms and behaviors originate from adapting to trauma exposures. So this is the idea that these responses don't need to be pathologized, but they're actually adaptive, but they may no longer be serving people. And that's when we want to, provide assistance. And if individuals are no longer being served by these adaptations, minimizing the risk of re-traumatization or replicating prior trauma dynamics, creating a safe environment, promoting choice and autonomy, creating collaborative relationships and participation opportunities. So I think this is especially key in doing research and practice populations that have been trauma exposed, ensuring that the research design, the research questions, the protocols are structured in a certain way that it's not reinforcing the sort of the dynamics that may have been present in previous trauma exposures, but it's making sure that the actual questions themselves and the research itself and the practice itself is serving the community that in which it's taking place. Viewing trauma through a socio-cultural lens. So this relates to the questions that I raised before of contextual and cultural adaptation, and then using a strengths-focused perspective to promote resilience. So this was something that we practiced a lot in the intervention that I spoke about before, but how is it possible what are existing resiliency structures? What are existing structures that work really well for individuals and communities, and how can those be drawn upon in whatever interventions that are being developed or any sort of innovations that are being supported. So these are just a short handful. There are many, many more, but I wanted to show these because I think it could be a good launching off point for discussion. And so now I want to open up the floor. I brought back this question that I opened with. So how can improving individual mental health affect community well-being? But I wanted to pose to all of you, in addition to answering any questions you may have, but how have you seen trauma, responses to trauma, trauma-informed perspective in your own work? What might be some contextual and cultural considerations that are important to consider in this work? And what might a trauma-informed approach look like for you? You may have already been implementing one in the past, or if you have questions about what it might look like for your work. But yeah, I look forward to our discussion.
Great, and thank you so much, Biz. That was really interesting and informative, and I think it relates to everything. We have mostly teachers on the call, but also some others. So yeah, feel free to put in the chat box, or if you would like to be unmuted, I can do that as well. Just let me know in the chat box. I think one of the things that, so Kate said strength-focused perspective sounds similar to assets-based community development. I'm also thinking of, as educators, we've done a lot of, a few years ago, social emotional learning and a little bit of the trauma-informed teaching. And then lately that's been kind of shut down by some parent groups and others who, don't see the importance of that. So we're seeing kind of still some of that, but some teachers being afraid to go to those methods as well, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, the social emotional learning, I think, overlaps a lot with sort of emotion regulation, capacity building things, because a lot of it is about recognizing your own emotions, being able to sort of name them, whether or not they're taking place in your brain, in your body, both. And then what strategies can you use to mitigate, to sort of like reflect on your emotions, name them, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of really great tools that can be used, but that's a shame to hear that teachers are being veered away from that.
And I'd be curious to hear from some of our participants, your thoughts about in other areas outside the US as well. We have folks from the DRC and Bosnia and some other areas. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or questions about this and what you're seeing in your work. And again, also those of you who are not educators. All right, Lita, I am going to unmute you here. I just have to find you on the list. There you are. Okay, Lita, you should be unmuted now.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm assuming you all can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Great. So just reflecting on that question, I'm happy to share. I can reflect on two levels of perspectives in my own experience, both one from, one from the context of my professional capacity, and the other where the professional and the personal sort of collided, so to speak. So on the former, I work on international women's issues, and in my career have focused on this issue both from a non-governmental environment as well as a federal environment. And in this space, there's a wide range of specific issues with respect to the challenges that women and girls face globally. And one of which is, of course, combating and preventing gender-based violence. And so to that end, in our work, we are very, very cognizant and mindful of ensuring that our engagement when we're meeting with communities in international travel or with beneficiaries of organizations that we are supporting, that we are taking a survivor sensitive approach, and that we are also integrating and requiring that our implementers are also taking those approaches into account when meeting with survivors. So that's one example I wanted to share in reflection. And then the other, with the recent fall of Kabul on August 15th, as a proud daughter of Afghan parents who were refugees during the war with the Soviet Union, first generation, born in the US, and also working on these issues in a professional capacity as a senior advisor for Afghanistan. This was a very unique space where I found myself having to learn more than I had realized I needed to better understand with respect to ancestral and generational trauma that was really coming and boiling to the surface in my professional capacity, in working and engaging with colleagues on this issue from a policy perspective, as well as in direct engagement with recently arrived refugees from Afghanistan, and working sort of in that entire process of settlement and processing, et cetera. So, in that case, it was very much overwhelming because at the same time, here are these individuals who are also experiencing some levels of trauma. But this was also very personally triggering as well. Over.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a incredibly important point, and something that I didn't even touch upon, that there's great research and thinking on, and the way in which trauma is carried across generations within families, understanding how it affects both parents and kids. It's really, really important to understand, and this, one of the limitations of the way that this definition of trauma is set up and this specific use of it is that it really is limited to the individual. It doesn't take into account sort of community trauma, social trauma, intergenerational trauma. And I think it's super important to have those conversations and to understand the ways in which these things might manifest similarly, might manifest differently. And it's especially tricky when you have to deal with it both, personally, and then when you're also in a professional environment. A lot of there's some really good research being done on trauma, some sort of secondary trauma as experienced by human rights workers who are working with advocates who are facing, sort of extreme repression while advocating for human rights in repressive societies. And even though they themselves are not necessarily targets of repression, the toll that's being taken when they're processing stories and when they're talking about people's stories, when they're hearing about the stories, and they have, workers in those contexts are not related to the individuals, but it's still a huge burden, and understanding the way that impacts burnout, the way that impacts their own mental health, the way that affects their work and their personal lives is really, really important. So the good thing about this kind of work is that it's really far reaching, in that I think it touches a lot of different points of personal and professional, people's personal and professional lives. Challenge is that because it is so far reaching, when you sort of take a little slice of it and talk about it, you leave all of these other really important slices out. So I appreciate your bringing that up. It's a really important perspective.
And Biz, we have a question from Patricia. Did you find any resistance to the peer methods approach, either from government officials or from the survivors themselves?
So super great question. The use of sort of individuals who are not professionals, who are not mental health care professionals being trained is actually, I think, one of the approaches that there has been not so much resistance on, which is both good and has its own challenges. So I'll start with the good. Because seeking mental health care has historically been really stigmatized in most places in the world. And that level of stigma has come down in varying degrees and varying contexts. I think there's been a huge improvement in recent years across many, many contexts, but in many places, it's still very stigmatized. It could be challenging to probably get a job. It could be challenging to integrate with family members if you're seen as having to seek out mental health support. So the great thing about a lot of peer-to-peer interventions is that they can be billed, makes it sound deceiving, but it's not. They can be sort of sold as or marketed or publicized as trainings rather than as mental health care support. So for example, the intervention that we did, individuals got a certificate at the end because they had completed this training and this program. And the training itself didn't ask individuals to share their own stories unless they wanted to. And so the nice thing about being able to have interventions delivered by peers is that they're less stigmatizing. Peers often have a better sense of what are the actual challenges that the individuals that they're working with are facing, because they often may have experienced some of those challenges themselves. Some of the challenges, though, are the thing that I just spoke about with secondary trauma. We had counselors set up so that if any of the individuals who were receiving the training needed support, they could seek out psychological support from trained professionals. And none of the individuals that signed up and enrolled in the intervention itself needed that. But the peer-to-peer, those that delivered the intervention often had more, because they were in a role of absorbing people's stories, of leading them through the trainings, and they often needed more support outside of the training itself. And so understanding the ways in which individuals who are being trained to deliver interventions need their own support systems, and setting those up in any kind of program that's being implemented, understanding how those individuals can be evaluated and supervised. So ensuring that there are safeguards in place to ensure that if there are issues that are arising, they're being brought up the chain and people are being able to receive the support that they need. Those are some of the challenges with peer-to-peer interventions. And there's a lot of good work being done thinking about how do you evaluate those that are delivering the training themselves, and do it in a way that makes sense given the intervention, given the context, and given the dynamics between the people that are receiving the intervention and the trainers.
And if there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or again, if you'd like to express them verbally, let me know and I'll unmute you. I was wondering, Biz, I'm really interested in the work that you did on A Woman's War. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what that was like. A lot of the areas that you were in are areas where EIHR has done work and continues to. And I'd just love to hear more about your experience and some of the findings that you ended up with.
Sure. So the sort of point of that project to start with was thinking about whose stories had been included in histories, whose stories had been reported on, and whose stories had not been. And so a common kind of theme was that women were often written about in the context of conflict in a specific way, or they were not written about at all. And so what the real point of the project was just to sort of collect different experiences, collect and document the lived experiences of women as they wanted to tell their stories. So it was really an oral history project. It was really seeking to both, and the questions really centered around what their lives were like leading up to the conflict and what their lives were like after. I provided a space if they wanted to share about what their experiences during the conflict was, but that was never a question that I asked explicitly, for the reason that I knew that I didn't want to ask people to re-experience that part of their lives unless they wanted to go there, and unless they felt like it was something that they wanted to revisit. And what the thrust of the project was really how have you been shaped as an individual in its aftermath, and what has it meant for you since the end of the conflict? And so the things that were really interesting that came out of that project was that everyone that I interviewed was really wanted to share their story, that there had been, especially for the conflicts that took place a long time ago, so particularly in Bangladesh and Vietnam and in Bosnia as well, there was a sense that like the attention had moved on, and therefore the time to share had passed. And so there was excitement to be able to have stories documented and sort of a retelling and revisiting of it. I think the most challenging context was Egypt, because I was there as the social unrest was actually occurring, and there was a lot of reporting on women in conflict there. But the reporting was seen by the women who were active in the social, uprising themselves, the political uprisings themselves, as biased, as sort of like going in, having a specific take, wanting to get interviews to support that take. And so the challenge there was really being able to say, like, no, there's no agenda here. I just want to know what you're experiencing as you're experiencing it. What do you see the narrative unfolding as at present? And if you were writing the narrative, what would the narrative be? So a lot of it was these sort of meta questions about like, how do you think the history should be written? How do you see it as being different from the history that you have known to be popularly conveyed? And it varied quite a lot depending on how long ago the conflict was, and sort of where the person was in their sense of being able to share their story. Some women were very well known and had been able to share their stories a lot, and some women were not very well known. And so there was a lot of variation across different stories shared. But the thing that was also especially very interesting was, as I worked on the project and as sort of the number of contexts that I worked in grew and the number of women that had participated grew, that was a really unique part of the project in and of itself. So when I'd approach someone to participate, I'd be able to share this sort of like trove of other stories of other women that had engaged in the project as well. And that was a sort of unintended consequence of being able to build this like library or this collection of oral histories of women engaged in conflict. And so that work really was a launching point for basically all of the research that I did, even though I've not really used the oral histories in any of the substantive research itself, both because of sort of ethical procedural purposes, like I didn't have IRB permission. That was a journalism project, and so it was a different protocol. And also because I think that really wasn't the point of that project. That project was documenting, it was being able to share and make sure that these stories were archived.
And Lita has another question, and it was on my mind as well. So thanks for asking, Lita. She says, are you currently doing any work in Ukraine related to these issues?
I am not, but I have some wonderful colleagues, some visual journalists who are, and I'd be happy to share some of their the work that they've done. But for example, I know Natalie Kisar is an incredible photojournalist, and she did an incredible story. I think it was in Time on women and the Ukraine, who were engaged in combat. And there are many, many, many more, and I'm happy to share those. There's really good work being done on this.
Yeah, we had a webinar last spring with Ron Haviv, and he shared
Mhm.
some of his pictures, and they
Yep.
were, yeah, just incredible work.
Yeah.
And I have noticed that shift toward, like in the New York Times, I think it was just a few weeks ago, a feature on women in combat in
Yeah.
Ukraine. Really interesting.
So I think that this is also interesting. I think that this shift happened, for example, with reporting on sexual violence and sexual harassment with Me Too, that it no longer needed to have a sort of newsworthy element, that it in and of itself was newsworthy. So I think, like, you know, in the past, reporting on women in combat would often require some kind of like peg. It would International Women's Day or something. Now I think there's more of a push to understand, like, this is a part of the story in and of itself. It doesn't need to have some kind of reason to make it newsworthy. It is newsworthy just by dint of it happening.
Exactly. And so Biz, yeah, you had mentioned sending some resources. I think everybody would appreciate that. If you just send them
Sure.
to me, I'll get them out to all the participants. I really especially love the slide before your last one, that when you said that, you know, we're all humans. Yeah, that one. And we need to know how to deal with other people, whether we're in these fields that often do have to, you know, be more trauma informed or not. We're all human. We need to know these. I think that's so well said. Thank you.
And my email is here. Feel free to shoot me a note if you have any other questions or want to get in touch. And thank you again, Kim and Kate, for having me. This was really wonderful.
Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And again, we hope to see you in the fall with the next series. And with that, I will end the program. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.